The Deviate Cycles Guide is a rather unique looking bike and a rather unique performing bike as well, but it's one that serves a relatively specific purpose, perhaps. The bike was designed by a couple of guys who have guided extensively in the Alps, so long days pedalling up big hills and then riding down incredibly technical, steep, gnarly terrain. Not necessarily bike park stuff, but real sinuous, tight, rooty, rocky single track. So as you can see, there's a few interesting sort of features of the bike. First off, there's the elevator chainstay with a high pivot point and the chain that goes over an idler wheel on that main pivot. The other one is, well, there's no rear derailleur on there because they're using the Pinion 12-speed system, which has a 600% gear range. Those are the two big talking points. The other one is that the frame is fully made out of carbon, so it's a pretty expensive bespoke built bike. The reason behind using the Pinion gearbox is that you get a very wide spread of gears with consistent jumps between each of those gears, as opposed to on a cassette where you get slightly bigger jumps at different points along the cassette. The weight is held low and central in the frame, and because there's no external moving parts, it's also meant to be incredibly reliable. If you're going to be riding down steep technical terrain, the last thing you're going to be doing is busting a mech off a rock or a root. And so with the Pinion, there's nothing hanging off the back wheel to get damaged. What it also means as a byproduct of that is that there's a lot less weight on the rear wheel, which lowers your unsprung mass of the bike, which in theory improves the sensitivity of it as there's less weight to be moved up and down. Having a high pivot point on a bike is quite an interesting way of manipulating how the rear suspension feels. If you have a relatively low pivot point, your back wheel goes up and forwards like this. Whereas if you raise that pivot point, the back wheel goes backwards and up first. Well, this means that the wheel moves out of the way over those bumps as opposed to moving forwards into them. This results in a lot more sensitivity and a much smoother feel over those bumps. And so, if you want a bike that's really designed for big hits and big technical terrain, having that high pivot point is an advantage. The disadvantage of having a higher pivot point though is that the feel through the pedals can be compromised. You get a bit of kickback through the pedals because that arc with the wheel moving backwards increases the distance between the cranks and the rear axle, resulting in chain growth, which results in pedal kickback. And this is why Deviate have routed the chain up and over an idler wheel on that main pivot point. This is to negate the pedal kickback and mean that the feel through the pedals is really consistent. This means it's less jarring, means it's more comfortable, and helps the suspension perform better. As we've learnt from e-bikes over the past few years, having a lot of weight low and central in the frame helps with sort of stability and the comfort and the performance of the rear suspension. And so the combined effect of having the Pinion down by the BB and having this high pivot point with that smooth arc for the rear wheel makes for a bike that tracks the ground incredibly well. It's definitely a trail bike, but the back end almost feels like a downhill bike. The rear wheel is stuck down to the ground, offering masses of traction, especially under braking and over sort of more technical terrain where you're hitting roots and rocks constantly. It's a bike that maybe doesn't feel fast downhill, but when you look back at your times on Strava, for example, or if you just hit a little jump that you already know and you sort of end up going miles past it, what you'll realise is that despite that sort of relatively slow or composed feeling, you're actually going real fast on this bike. That's certainly the case on steeper terrain. On more mellow stuff where you're sort of having to pedal a lot, I actually didn't hugely get on with the bike. It's not wallowy as such, but it's not the tautest of bikes when you're sort of putting the power down. And also there is that inherent sort of drag in the Pinion box. And as a disclaimer, I did use this bike when it was pretty fresh, so the box hasn't really worn in, which is something that happens over the course of a few thousand kilometres. But it's a bike that is a little bit sluggish on flatter terrain. This is a bike definitely suited to sort of those alpine rides where you are going to be basically either pedalling up or going straight down. The other sort of issue we had with this on sort of more twisty, pedally terrain is that there's two freewheels within the bike. There's one in the Pinion hub and there's one at the rear wheel. So if you're trying to put a few quick pedal strokes in between corners, you often get quite a lot of pedal stroke before you actually engage with the drivetrain. And I wasn't a massive fan of this feeling. This also comes into play perhaps on technical climbs where you might have to do a little bit of ratcheting to get sort of past sort of trail features, whether there's rocks at the side. That lag again sort of comes into play there. So aside from the actual drivetrain feeling a little bit funny, the other thing you might have to get used to is the way the pinion works. Instead of having a normal thumb shifter, you have a grip shift. Some people will like this, some people won't. Personally, I didn't mind it. It's a better shape than the roll-off shifter, I think. It's a bit more slimline. The other issue as such is that you can't actually change gear very easily under power. It simply doesn't really want to go, so you have to back off the pedals completely to change. This is a bit annoying again on those sort of flowy trails where you want to be shifting up a few gears, and also on climbs where you sort of are going to lose a little bit of momentum. The benefit of it though is that you can shift when you're stationary, or say you're coming down a steep chute and you've been in a higher gear and you've got to go up somewhat steep on the other side, you can just bang down a load of gears in one go. So actually I think you do get used to it. It's just a different way of looking at how you use your gears. The suspension itself works really nicely thanks to that idler, the high pivot point, and with all that weight low down in the bike. And sat just above the pinion is the shock. It's a Cane Creek DB inline, and it's really controllable, really adjustable shock. You might need to spend a little bit of time getting used to playing with it because there are so many controls, so do spend a bit of time setting up to get it right. When you've got it though, it's incredibly smooth, it's incredibly controlled, and I got on with it pretty well. The other issue I had with the guide was the sizing is a little bit funny. I'm 6 foot tall, so I'd ride a large naturally, and Deviate offer a medium and large bikes. However, while the length of the bike is great at 475mm in reach for the size large, the seat tube is really long. With the 150 post that came as standard, I had to absolutely slam it in order to be able to fit on the bike. So the seat tube is almost like an XL. My colleague Seb Stott, who's 6'3", would ride a bike with a seat tube that long fine, but found the reach a little bit too short. So you might want to have a little think about sort of how long your legs are in proportion to your body, and have a look at the sizing, because we just feel that the seat tube is just too long. If you're going to spend a lot of time pedaling up long hills and then hitting really steep technical terrain, you know, where you need a lot of traction and a lot of comfort and control from the bike, this bike will work great. So the guys who are guiding out in the Alps and they've built this bike, I really understand why they built it like this, and for them, I reckon it works great. If you're a trail rider in the UK though, where you're riding sort of flatter trails where there's a lot of pedal inputs, a lot of shifting, a lot of stop-start, I'm not convinced it's going to be the best companion for you. I think you want a little bit more instantaneous reaction to your pedal inputs. I think you're going to want a bike that doesn't feel quite as sluggish, maybe one that has a bit more feedback through the back wheel, something a bit more lively perhaps. But I really applaud these guys for making this bike. It's a beautifully made bike, and it's one that works really well. It's very interesting, and it's great to have companies that are pushing sort of the concepts of gearboxes, high pivot points, and really designing bikes for a specific purpose. And as I said, I think it works great for what they've designed it to do.